Hey everybody, Jonathan Broadbent here, your host of UnWoke.Academy. Welcome to another PMA episode. As promised, the plan is every Wednesday at noon Eastern Time. I plan to go live and open up the floor to discussion and conversation around the Private Membership Association. And just to bring everybody back up to speed on what that is, or anybody that's new to the conversation, it started as a newsletter a long time ago, calling out what I call the woke on Wall Street years ago in a newsletter called Unwoke Investing. Is really effectively the stuff that was interfering with financial due diligence and the right types of choices that have existed forever, like replacing investment management with this veneer of social justice, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is just CRT rebranded, and the environmental push and all that stuff. And I started talking years ago about that needing to have a clear definition in order to influence the trillions of dollars of people's investment savings. And that eventually turned into the financial, the UnWoke.Academy. UnWoke.Academy, as people sort of started to ask questions about where the good places to invest are, turned into the financial PMA. And again, I'm going to keep saying this. Everything we do is shared publicly. I hope that lots of people out there grab this stuff and run with it wherever you are. There's no obligation for anybody to join the financial PMA. In fact, if you work in or near finance, take the ideas of it and duplicate it somewhere else. Just the objective is defund the woke, or as we like to say, dis the globalist left, which stands for know where you donate, invest, or spend your money. Dis the globalist left. And as things evolved, I wanted to launch a platform where we can talk about the financial PMA. That led to Wednesdays at noon, and just doing a live stream, which reminds me, comments are open. We are live right now on Rumble, X, YouTube, and Facebook. On X, you'll find me under my personal profile. I do actually have the handle Unwoke Investing, but we don't have a lot of followers there. And so I use my personal profile, which is JR Broadbent. That's just first initial, middle initial, last name, JR Broadbent. If you want to find me on X, you're going to find a lot of conversation there. I do still post things in the Unwoke community and under that profile, but I just find I get a lot more interaction just by using my existing personal profile because I have a lot more followers there. On the other platforms or wherever you are, if you are watching this live and questions occur to you, pose those questions. I'll do my best to incorporate them. I want to kick things off by starting in an area that is near and dear to me, an area of the world of finance that I know well. It's actually how I built my career. It's in the administration of 401k plans. And I'm going to take you back in the Wayback Machine and talk a little bit about the history that you may not know, or if you're old enough, you may recall this, about the way that 401k plans used to work, because that unfortunate environment tries to manifest itself in lots of different places in finance. So back in the day, back in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, when 401k plans were really taking off and they were replacing, the original objective wasn't to replace, the original stated intention was to augment pension plans. But eventually they did that. They usurped and then took over, and pension plans kind of died off. But anyway, that's a side note. That's a topic for a different podcast. Um, but as 401k plans took off and became all the craze publicly, and companies clamored to start up and implement a 401k plan, there are lots of companies out there that tried to do everything for the 401k plan. So they would offer the mutual funds, they would do the technology and servicing of it, they would do the payroll deduction, and they would charge for all that stuff. And for a while, it was tremendously profitable and had to have been viewed like shooting fish in a barrel, because you had these companies with sometimes lots of employees, and they would try to sell banking services, they would load up the plan. And believe it or not, if you're young, this will seem strange to you, but back in the day, your investment choices would all have one name. So it might be XYZ Mutual Fund Company, and all your choices were actually, you might have 15 different mutual funds, but they were all run by the same company, which was the same company that offered you the 401k plan. So they would just made money. What's the expression? 6 ways from Sunday. They made money all kinds of different ways. Well, eventually, people got savvy to that and they started to get smart, especially in large plans, and they pushed for something called open architecture. It's a beautiful term. You should know it. And it's a wonderful thing that finally kicked in. And I actually was in the industry and working on retirement plans, workplace retirement plans, for the rollout and implementation of that. And it was really great to watch, because then people got to go out and cherry pick the best of breed in all asset classes. What that means is all the different objectives of different types of mutual funds. You could scour the broad universe and pick the ones that you liked best. So, in a large cap fund or an international fund or a small cap fund, or heck, even funds that were really specifically focused on things like real estate, or that worked in healthcare and medicine, whatever, you could look for whatever you wanted and find the best performing and add it to your 401k plan. Well, now it just, in retrospect, it seems like common sense. And that actually is evolving still in a really beneficial way. What we're starting to see is a lot of 401k plans adding something called self-directed brokerage accounts, SDBA for short. Self-directed brokerage accounts give people, you, the employee at a company, the ability to go beyond that little menu of mutual funds and maybe build your own portfolio. So if you have guidance somewhere that you like, and that could be the research and reporting that we do at UnWoke.Academy, it could be anything anywhere. It could be your own research. Maybe you have a stock brokerage trading account somewhere, and you get all sorts of great insights that you like. Not many people know this. It's still not common knowledge that there's nothing prohibiting you from doing those same trades, not in mutual funds, but in buying different stocks and all kinds of different investments, exchange traded funds, you name it, virtually anything on any platform anywhere, if your employer allows it. So I still advocate and I encourage people out there to organize at your employer, if you have a 401k plan or something like it, and check into adding self-directed brokerage account, because that's that next step in the evolution. And an analogy occurs to me, and I'm going to preface this by saying it may not be my best analogy yet because I'm actually not a gambler. I've been to Vegas, I've been to New Orleans, and I understand the appeal. For people that like to go to whatever, the card table and stuff, that's just not me. But in the world of sports betting, also not me, it doesn't appeal to me, but it's cool if it does to you. But there is something that I think is really compelling as I watch people who do gamble, and that's the whole idea of fantasy football. Well, back in the day, it used to be the case that if you were betting on a team. And don't hold it against me. I grew up a Browns fan. I am a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan and whatever other teams. For me, it was the Cleveland Indians and eventually the Cavs. I got into them. But it used to be that you would bet on a team. Well, the whole idea, and this seems alien to me, but it's also kind of cool at the same time, this fantasy football or fantasy teams where people can bet apparently on their favorite players. So you could have players from all kinds of different teams and cherry pick and build this fantasy team. Well, that's really how 401ks evolved. It went from you're betting on a team, and it really in the world of 401k, it wasn't even like you could go outside of your city. Wherever your local team was, you were required to bet on just that team. That's the way that 401k plans started. They were very, very limited in what you could do, and then they've expanded and expanded again. And now there's a new step that I'm reading about. There's some new legislation that might allow for what's called non-traded. And that'd be, I think, using the sports analogy, that'd be akin to being able to bet on farm team franchise or farm team players, like the people who aren't yet up in professional sports. Hopefully that analogy makes sense. But that that is where the investing world needs to go. And it happens to be the exact opposite of what this whole idea of the S&P 500 or NASDAQ, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, sorry, NASDAQ, I interjected unintentionally. NASDAQ is actually a trading platform. But these indexes that are frequently referenced, in fact, pretty much daily on legacy media and radio outlets, etc., when they talk about the market being up or the market being down, I'm air quoting that, it's nonsense. Not only do you have this very limited scope of observation, you have very limited number of companies. And so S&P 500, using that as an example because it's the most quoted in my experience and estimation, the S&P 500 has a total of 503 companies listed in it. That's that's it. In the whole broad world of all the companies out there that you might invest in that are publicly traded, that represents 503 companies. By the way, it's important to note that nobody can actually invest in the S&P 500. There are investment managers and there are algorithms and trading platforms out there that try their best to duplicate whatever is happening in the S&P 500, but ultimately, what we've ended up with in this whole discussion, as we allow the media to sort of browbeat us into the notion that this S&P 500 that somebody created a hundred or so years ago is somehow indicative of what's actually happening in the world of financing for business, because that's ultimately what the stock markets are for. They're there to fund businesses. And now the S&P 500 is roughly 40%-ish of the S&P 500 is invested in only 8 different companies. So out of that 503, subtract roughly uh, the remainder, 503, you've got 8 companies out of the broad universe 495 of those companies fall into only 60% of the S&P 500. Uh, Hopefully that math resonates with you, but even the S&P 500 is drastically overinflated and engineered into a very small number of companies, 8-ish. So I looked it up. And actually, I'm going to pose this as a trivia question before I expose the answer. Anybody that's listening on any of the platforms where we're live right now, put in the notes and comment if you know how many, just ballpark, just guess, and don't cheat, don't look it up or use AI. How many U.S. based companies are publicly traded right now? I'm going to pause before I say the answer to that, and I'm actually going to reference 1996. For basis of comparison, there was a much larger number of US-based publicly traded companies in 1996. That was 8,090, according to a search that I did in the lead up to this show and making my show notes. I used Grok. But according to Grok, in 1996, there were 8,090 companies that were publicly traded. That meant if you are investing in an IRA account or starting up a stock brokerage account or whatever, 401k or investing somewhere, you could go and look at you could have in 1996, over 8,000 different companies and pick some that you liked, that you believed in, that you wanted to participate in the ownership and creating value, and you wanted to fund them for, pardon me, for future growth. And how exciting was that? In 1996, you could invest in these great American companies. So, by the way, as I pause before revealing the most recent numbers I was able to pull for US based publicly traded companies, put your answer in the comments. And I don't know, I'll, if you want me to, I'll recognize whoever answers closest. I'm keeping an eye on the comments section here. But these numbers, everything I'm talking about so far, that's just the United States. There are companies all over the world. And yes, some of them are bad and should be avoided if we are leaning our money into promoting Western values. There are some companies out there that are aligned against the US and Western values. We covered that in great detail in the interview that I did with Justin Bernier on the National Security Index. That go back to, I want to say it was May of around May of March, April, May area of 2024. Go back and watch that interview with Justin Bernier. He talks about the use of offshore investment managers to funnel US investment dollars into the growth and expansion of the Chinese Communist Party's military. That's awful. We should not be investing in those. But crossing those off the list, there are all kinds of great companies, tens of thousands of them, all over the world that it may make sense to look at and consider investing in. So now look at that big, broad picture, and let's apply that analogy of the fantasy football or fantasy league. What we've ended up with as we allow this discussion of the S&P 500 being the market, quote unquote, we've allowed ourselves into this ridiculous thought process that we have 8 companies that deserve the lion's share of all funding, in spite of the fact that I'll argue they're drastically inflated in stock price. Their stock price just makes no sense. It's way too high. And anybody still continuing to hug that index in any way, shape, or form, buying an index fund, buying a fixed index annuity that's based off of the S&P 500, or buying those stocks, anything like it, I think just makes no sense at this point in this environment. This is not investment advice. This is just general food for thought as we delve into the research that we do at UnWoke.Academy. Putting it all together, that's the job of the financial PMA, or take the research and use it as a starting point for yourself. So I'm not seeing anybody venturing into a guess as to the more current numbers for US-based uh, publicly traded companies. As of the end of 2022, which is the most recent reported, we have 4,642, again, according to Grok. This is a Grok answer that I got on the platform X. 4,642, which means that the 503 companies in the S&P 500, that little block of companies that are publicly traded that represent that S&P 500 are around 9.25%, a little over. Less than 10% of even just US-based companies are what we're talking about. Every time you hear that sort of sad, somber music that comes on the radio, and they're like, oh, the bluesy sound, and they're like, the stock market is down today, or that sort of peppy, upbeat music, hooray! And there's like little piped in crowd cheering noises, and they're like, the stock market is up today. It's fiction. It's nonsense. That is not the market. It's a tiny little segment within the market, and it happens to be the segment that is overwhelmingly, it's drastically inflated globalist mega companies. Anybody America First, MAGA, anybody paying attention to Trump's February 21st America First investment policy that he released should be opposed to that. Anybody who's interested in funding the next big company and American enterprise and capital markets, free market economy should be really arguably the opposite of the S&P 500. Look at the other 495 companies out there. Or excuse me, I'm looking at the total number of companies, 4,690, 4,642. Can't read my own writing here. Those are the total number of US-based companies publicly traded currently, or approximately that number. That is over 4,100 different companies that we should be looking at. We should be talking about these companies and whether or not there's value in building them into your portfolio and investing in them, because some of them might be the great new best thing to hit the market. Of course, those small number of companies in the S&P 500 don't want competition and don't want money going to fund what could usurp them, it could take them over and become their competitor. That's the environment that we're talking about here. An S&P 500 presented as the market, I keep air quoting that, just to drive that point home. It is not the market. The S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, things like it, there's somebody applying some sort of metric to talk about a very small segment of the investable marketplace. So if you can get that inside your 401k, and if you can build a better portfolio in a better way that doesn't fund the woke, and maybe gets you in a better position to enjoy and feel confident in what you own, that meets your moral value system, that is America first and does well, you're in a better world. We're all in a better world. We're funding a better future for generations to come. And in my closing comments, I'm going to talk about the most recent numbers we have for one of the people who is in the financial PMA. There's a woman that I actually personally helped make some trades on October 7th and October 8th of 2024. And in the larger of the two accounts, working on behalf of her family, she has an unrealized gain. She has gained 38.54%. That's an average return, average of the various different investments that we ended up selecting with her, of 43.29%. Average return of 43.29%. Compare that to what's actually happening in the S&P 500. Although we've got so much focused in so few companies, at last look, it was around 2.96%. And even that, I argue, is fiction. So would you rather fund the woke with very little return and, I argue, danger to you and your portfolio, or take the advice of people like me and Donald Trump and his America First investment policy and invest in things in that much broader universe that may make a lot more sense for you. That is the news that's fit to report on the Financial PMA. There is a website, actually. It's financialpma.com. We do have that website. There's a short little intro video that I made that cues up the idea of a financial PMA. Actually, I am going to insert one other food for thought, and that is the amount of data mining that happens in the financial world. If you think there's data mining from tech and your smartphone, you haven't looked at finance yet. There is such an insatiable appetite to know everything there is to know about you and your financial life, what you own, what you trade, how much you have, what you like to buy, when you buy, etc. It makes a lot of sense for us to be collaborating and working together now to try to put some boundaries up, to try to carve out and create as much protection for your personal data as possible. That's another element of the financial PMA. It's kind of a side note, or for some people, I think it may be a leading concern. But whatever your reasoning, I hope you'll consider the financial PMA, or, as I said, take it and run with it. Duplicate everything we're doing somewhere else, working with whomever you like. I'm Jonathan Broadbent. This has been another Wednesday noon Eastern Time special episode focusing on the financial PMA. Thanks for tuning in.